Hello and welcome to Full Contact Nerd Interviews. I'm Chris Alvarez and thank you for watching. I'm speaking with Sofia Loden, author of French Romance, Medieval Sweden, and the Europeanization of Culture, published by D.S. Brewer, January 6th, 2021. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thanks for having me.
So first, how did you get into studying and writing a book on a subject like this?
It is the result of, I would say it started as a student. I went to France when I was 19 years old, and I was very interested in French in general. I wanted to learn the language, so I went to the university and I studied literature, French literature. And then I took a course on medieval French literature, and I really found that absolutely fascinating in all sorts of ways. And that was how it started, basically. And then I came back to Sweden and I wrote my little thesis, and then I wrote a bigger thesis, and then I went back to France, and then I ended up doing a doctoral dissertation on the topic. But then I started my doctoral dissertation in France, and I got the feeling that it was very hard for a Swedish person to write on the only the French literature. So I felt that I had to bring in the Swedish side of it, which was perhaps a bit strange. But then I ended this thesis, and that was in 2012, and it wasn't really finished, I think. So I had to go on. So I think this is the book that had to be written. It's a much it's not my thesis, but it was the next step after this thesis, because the Swedish translations of medieval French literature, they deserve much more attention than they have received. And in my first, as a doctoral student, I only studied one specific text. But in this book, I have chosen to look at several texts, and also to broaden the perspective and to try to place these texts in the pan-European context, because you cannot understand. That is really my conclusion for more and more, that you cannot speak really of French literature, Swedish literature. Everything is so connected, and you have to put all these texts together. You have to understand them as part of a larger European literature.
Mm-hmm. So what time period, as far as the Swedish translations, what time period? Well, what time period do the French romances come from, and what
Mhm.
period are the Swedish translations from?
Yeah, so the first French texts that I study are from the 12th century, but then I don't have a very specific limit, so I look at later texts as well, and the latest is dated to the 15th century, so 12th to 15th centuries. But they arrive much later in Sweden. So the texts that are written in 12th century France, they are translated generally in the beginning of the 14th century in Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
And the latest Swedish text that I look at appears in the 16th century.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite a broad scope of a broad time period.
Mm-hmm. And it's one thing that strikes me is that it's interesting that you would have a type of literature that's popular in France, in this period that's sort of pre-Renaissance, and then it becomes popular in Sweden, say 200 years later. I'm just thinking culturally and politically, what does that say about each of them?
Yes, it's a very good point. It's very interesting, but in a way it also I think it says something about the genre of romance in itself, in the sense that, perhaps it reminds us that these texts people didn't lose interest in King Arthur or related genres after the 12th centuries. These texts continued to circulate in Europe, and even after, even when you started to print texts, these texts were still read. So in a way, it's only that the text that what that were actually translated in Sweden, their sources, they are older than the Swedish texts. But if you look at these texts as a bigger tradition, I think it's not that simple. It's not only that everything arrives later in Sweden. It is moving around. But of course, it is in many ways in the Francophone area that these texts are born, more or less. So and then they spread, and they spread very quickly to what we call Germany today, and they come relatively quickly to Norway and to Iceland. Sweden comes after. So of course it takes time before these texts reach Sweden, and Sweden is sort of periphery at this, in the Middle Ages.
So translating it, does that mean that it was able to get to more of the noble class in Sweden, or did it spread more to the lower classes, who didn't know French,
But this is really courtly literature, so it's written for the court at the instigation of a queen or a nobleman. So this is not at all texts that were read by people outside, I would say, of the aristocracy, or at least a very highly educated class. So it's it doesn't reach far. But that's also what's interesting, because that is also the thing it's like that in almost every country. Each court in the Middle Ages needed to produce literature and a specific type of literature, courtly romance, Arthurian romance, other types of romances. And that was also the case for Sweden. But it doesn't reach very far in terms of readers, or it's really a very the courtly, the aristocratic public.
And so what Swedish literature existed, before these made their way into the Swedish courts, and did they supplant the older stuff in any way, or did they add to it?
That's very interesting. So because and that's an important argument in my book, because Swedish literature, you could say, starts with these translations. Of course, we have rune stones, we have shorter pieces in written texts in Swedish, but we don't have longer fiction before these first translations of romances. So translation, and that is still the case, translation is extremely important in order to create new literary traditions. And in the case of medieval Sweden, translation of romance functions as a means to establish a Swedish national literature in a way, because then these translations will inspire indigenous texts. So nothing is born out of nothing. Everything is, all these influences, they are so important and influences from abroad.
So was it, who was doing these translations? Was it your standard medieval monks, Christian monks, who were deciding what to translate and how?
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't really know who did it, but we can assume that the translator or the translators, they were educated, which meant that they had some kind of Christian education, perhaps a monk, or at least somebody who was schooled, but we don't really know. There are hypotheses, there are certain names, but you cannot be sure of it. But we can imagine that it was a man of the church, probably somebody who had studied abroad, because we tend to forget that the intellectual milieu of the Middle Ages was international, and that people, the educated ones, they did travel. So, for example, in my case, I think that my translators, they probably spent time at the University of Paris. Probably they might have picked up these texts, or they discovered, they got familiar with the language, etc. And then they came back to Sweden, and then they were able to translate it. But then we have the people at the court who appear in the texts, and who are said to be the ones who actually ordered the translation, who said that I want this text to be translated. That is often something that we can read about in the epilogue or the prologue. And in the case of the first Swedish translations, this is the person who is who is spoken of in the texts themselves is a queen. It's the Queen of Norway, actually, Queen Euphemia. And it is Euphemia who is supposed to have ordered a translation of the very first texts. And Euphemia was born in Rügen in Germany, and she arrived in Norway in order to marry. So you could imagine perhaps that she knew this literature from her childhood. That was something that she got acquainted with in Germany, and then she had a heritage, and then she came to Norway, and then she wanted to bring this culture into the Scandinavian one. Mm-hmm. Her daughter was supposed to marry a Swedish duke, so that is what scholars generally give us the explanation why she had these texts translated as a sort of gift when her daughter married this duke.
Mm-hmm. And do you agree with that?
I agree with. I think that Euphemia played a very important role, but of course, I'm not the only one who saying this, but I don't think that. I mean, these texts were not only gifts; they were more powerful. They were also political tools. They were very conscious ideological projects in a way. It's not only it was of course thought to amuse the court, to have fun. It's the first function, I think, but they were also there in order to educate the nobility and to transmit something. And during this period, the Norwegian court, they had translated most of these texts, and they had a very strong literary culture already, and that was not at all the case in Sweden. And I think that, I mean, the Swedish texts are in many ways different from the Norwegian ones. So there is a rupture, and I think that is a very conscious rupture as well, that may have been very intentional on behalf of the Queen. She introduces very clearly a very Germanic influence.
I'm speaking with Sofia Loden, author of French Romance, Medieval Sweden, and the Europeanization of Culture. You can find more information about her work on her academic webpage. If you like this episode of Full Contact Nerd interviews so far, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you want daily book suggestions for new fiction and nonfiction studies in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, mysteries, gaming, game design, film history, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, War Scholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. Now back to the video.
So let's talk then about the differences from the French sounds like we can talk about, what was different? What did they focus on that the French may not have focused on?
Yeah. So if I'm very general, um, I would say that the Swedish texts, they are they really focus on the question of courtliness, courtly behavior, how to behave as a member of the court, and the questions about female and male identity. That is very, very general, but it's really the theme that I mean goes through all these texts. The French texts in general are very sophisticated. Literally, they are really literary masterpieces. They are extremely sophisticated on so many levels. You can and it's very hard to. It's not that the Swedish translator doesn't contradict the French writers. He doesn't go against him, but he chooses a more specific interpretation that is really focused on courtliness, on certain values. A bit less interested in questions about love, for example, because love is a very literary theme, and I suppose very difficult to depict in literature, and the translators generally chose a more political interpretation.
And just to, I've been assuming all these romances are, you have your standard romance between knights and their ladies, and the knights go out and do quests or have battles with other knights, and they go through that whole thing. Is that all of these are like that, right? Or is there any significant differences?
Yeah, but more or less. But I'm studying 4 textual traditions, 4 different texts that all spread not only from France to Sweden, but in the whole of medieval Europe. And the first one, Ivan, or the Knight of the Lion, it's a purely Arthurian romance, so with adventures and ladies and damsels and everything. The very what we may think of as a very typical medieval romance. The second one is a love tale, really, Floire et Blanchefleur, idyllic romance. It's about 2 children who grow up together, and they fall in love as children, and then they are separated by their parents. So that a bit less of adventures and much more of love. And the third one, Valentin et Ourson, it's a bit different. Again, it's about 2 twin brothers, and they are abandoned as babies in the woods. And then one of them is brought up in a very courtly milieu, and the other one is brought up in the wild. And then one day they are reunited, and lots of adventures happen. But it's really the starting point is this. Is the fact that one grows up in the civilized world and the other one in wilderness, and what happens. And the third one, Paris Vienne, is a love tale again. There are many parallels to Floire et Blanchefleur. It is also about 2 children, you could say, and they who are separated. They are in love, but their parents they don't want them to be together, and then lots of things happen from there. So it's love stories and stories about adventures.
Well, I also notice it seems to be a lot, at least the twin brothers, the the importance of maybe family or blood as well. And I
Yeah.
think about that because it seems that just reading the history, histories of noble families in Europe, you had a lot of illegitimate children who might come back to try to reclaim titles and stuff. So politically, you have a lot of people wondering about their birthright and what's important. So I'm
Absolutely,
just wondering.
yes. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
do these stories reflect? It sounds like these stories reflect that to some extent.
Yeah, I haven't thought so much about it, I have to confess, but it sounds, yeah, why not? I think so. Yes, you could say that. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So have we
Uh,
touched on all the difference? You did mention the Swedish focus on courtly manners and rules. What other differences did you see? And maybe not just in Sweden, but in the other countries as well, their focus.
mm, um, Yeah, for example, I was fascinated by the role of animals. That it's
Mm,
not a big theme, but it's still there. So in this very famous story about Ivan, the Knight of the Lion, it's a knight, once again he meets a lion,
mhm,
and the lion is very interesting. Of course, the lion is such a fascinating animal when you consider medieval culture,
mhm,
and then the Swedish translator will choose to depict the lion in a new way. He will make the lion female in a way, and instead of writing a lot about the lady of the romance and the love affair between the lady and the knight,
mhm,
I think that the lion in some way will take the place of the lady, and I found that very fascinating,
mhm,
and also the role of the spoken language. So this Swedish lion
mhm.
will start to speak in a way that the French lion doesn't really, and that comes back in one of the other texts that with so this wild brother I told you about, these two twin brothers. One grows up in the forest, and so this wild brother who grows up in the forest is taken care of by a wolf, and so he will become a wolf, and then it's a very funny text, because you can, I mean, what happens to this wild man who is behaving like a wolf, and there is a fascination on behalf of, I think, the Swedish translator, but also the translator tries to make the animal more human, and um, the animal really becomes a vehicle to discuss this question of what, I mean, the what is the difference between education and not having an education. What differs between the wild and the civilized. So the role of animals was one thing that I think was really, I mean, it's interesting for me as a modern reader, but it was also very interesting for the medieval reader.
How much did you find that maybe the old Scandinavian myths, with all their spirits and creatures and animals,
Mm.
having such importance, did you see that finding its way at all into the Scandinavian translations?
Oh, not really.
Hmm,
Not really. And once again, there is a dividing line, I would say, between you have the Norwegian and Icelandic culture on the one hand, and then
hmm,
the Swedish and Danish culture on the other. And of
hmm,
course, you mainly perhaps associate these myths with the Icelandic sagas. Of
hmm,
course, it's not that simple, and you have these kinds of myths in Swedish culture as well. But the problem is that, I mean, these are the very first longer literary texts that are preserved. So it's hard to compare and to know where things come from.
hmm,
Um, Maybe, but yeah, very hard to say. But I would say that these translations very clearly, um, they don't really try to connect with so much with the indigenous culture in that sense. They want to introduce all these elements from abroad, from the continental culture from France.
hmm,
That is one of the main purposes, I would say, with the translations. So perhaps I could imagine that the translator, he tries to tone down the Scandinavian uh, interpretations, or try to insist rather on the continental ones, if you see what I mean.
hmm. So how about the magic, like I don't know how much these, the whole Merlin idea of Merlin, the mystical, how much of a difference, or how much is there in each of these different groupings?
I would say that you have much more. I'm sorry to say that, but in the French, and once again, they remain more sophisticated in that sense. They manage so beautifully to mix this magic with elements from reality, with the love theme and the adventures, and the balance is perfect in a sense. And the Swedish versions, they will. They will have to clean a bit in order to make certain points clear. It doesn't mean that they are not sophisticated as well, but the magic is not the main. It's not what is, I think, what the Swedish translators really found interesting. Perhaps it was difficult to translate. So it is perhaps a bit lost. It's there, but you have it much more in the French text and in the German ones. So you can feel that I think it's because the Swedish literary culture is so new. So it's not possible to connect to so many other texts. So you have to be a bit more clear about what you want to say. Otherwise it would be too much. Whereas, of course, the French writers, they are part of a very well-established literary culture already. So they don't have to explain everything, because they can give hints, they can connect to previous texts easily, and they are part of something much bigger.
That's interesting. Yeah, wow, that's fascinating. So I'm curious how the use of Latin affects any of this. Was French just the language of medieval Europe at this time, that anyone educated would know some French, or?
Very good question. But no, I don't think that French was the language of all the educated people. And in I mean, of course, the language of education was Latin, as you say. So if you had an education, you knew Latin. That was the language to know. But then in Sweden during the Middle Ages, of course, Middle Low German was the second language due to the Hanseatic League. So that was a very important language. And if you look at the Swedish language today, you will find so many loan words, and many from German, and many of them came with the contacts with the Low German language in the Middle Ages. The French influence. There are some loan words from French in the Middle Ages, but they are mostly linked actually to these texts, to the courtly literature, and they are very few, very, very few. So no, I think that, I mean, these translators, they must have learned French when studying in Paris. But then I should also say that this is translations from French, because in all texts go back to a French text. But that doesn't mean that the translator used the French source always. Often he had another source, so an intermediary one. So it is actually only one of these texts that we really know is translated from the French, or at least I believe that it was translated from the French. But in the other cases, these are translations from Old Norse, Old West Norse, so the language that was spoken in Norway and Iceland, or Low German.
So how about the effect that the Swedish translations, or even any of the Scandinavian translations, did they have an effect in turn back on, German and French texts in any way? Any influence?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. But what happened in a way was that these Swedish texts were picked up in Denmark. So if you want to find a result of the Swedish translations, you could look at the Danish context, because you will have translations into Old Danish of the Swedish translations. But I am not sure that actually the Swedish text came back to France, or that is only now, I think, because there is a big interest in France for these I mean, for the Nordic reception of French literature today, but that is today. So it took many hundred years, I think. No, I don't think it really came back. Of course, there are some influences from Scandinavian culture on the French context, but that is mostly words that came with the Vikings, but it's very limited. And in terms of literature, I at least I don't know that there was such an influence. Maybe, but I don't know it really. No.
So with the translations, just extrapolating to sort of more modern literature that maybe deals with Arthurian type or maybe fantasy and that sort of thing. Do modern and let's say, 18th, 19th, 20th century in these countries, do you see any traditions extend out, individual traditions that
Yeah,
extend out?
that's interesting. I see. And you mean on the Swedish side, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would say that the text among the four that I have studied, it is one that attracted most interest in the later context, and that is Floire et Blanchefleur. So this story about the two children who fall in love, the two lovers. That is the tale that really interested the readers in the, I would say, 19th century. And the other texts were quite forgotten, whereas today I would say I tend to believe that it is really the more Arthurian tradition and the stories about the knightly adventures that capture the modern readers, that connect to modern culture. But it's very strange because these texts are not until quite recently, they are very little known in Sweden. They are not. This is nothing you learn about in school or. Yeah, it's quite an unknown literature, really. So and still you have this, I mean, really big interest in fantasy and so I hope that people will soon discover also the medieval origin, and especially the Swedish one, since it's interesting in terms of, I mean, in order to understand Swedish literature as a tradition. I think it's very interesting to remember that it was born in a process of exchange in translation.
I'm speaking with Sofia Loden, author of French Romance, Medieval Sweden, and the Europeanization of Culture. You can find more information about her work on her academic webpage. If you like this episode of Full Contact Nerd interviews so far, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you want daily book suggestions for new fiction and nonfiction studies in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, mysteries, gaming, game design, film history, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, War Scholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. Now back to the video.
And it also makes me wonder, and we sort of touched on this on our emails, and I don't know how much you can speak to it, but so the Swedish military became very powerful around, I think it was the 1600s, and I just wonder how, they supplanted some of the other major European powers, and I just wonder how much this literature may have been read or discussed by the more, martial types among the Swedes? Was it just like, whatever, that's children's,
Yeah,
literature or
yeah, it's a good question. 16th century, it's very hard to say, but at least I think that I mean, when Queen Euphemia had these texts translated in the 14th century, I would believe, and I don't, of course, I couldn't prove this, but my impression is that it is really about educating the young knights at the Swedish court, who probably had very bad manners, who were probably not sophisticated and educated at all, because these texts are very educating. They teach us good manners, so that is a very important aspect. It's not so much about being only strong in battle, but to be this you should also help ladies, and you should care about your the people close to you, and you should help the weak, and all these values, what it is to be a good knight. I think that was extremely important.
Mhm.
And if there is one value that dominates in all Swedish texts, that's the question of honor. Honor is everything is about honor. Also, love is linked to honor. So it will bring honor to marry the right lady for the knight. If you're brave in battle, you will you receive knightly honor. You will. The lion is also represents the knight's honor, and so on. Everything is about honor.
Mhm. So when you say the right woman, marrying the right woman, is it the right woman for love or the right woman as far as her status within, you know?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it is about status, and then the love theme is something that these texts perhaps try to bring in a way, that there is, and love to me is very much a literary thing. It's connected to the continental tradition, to France. Love is something that they are supposed to learn, because it's also sophisticated. It's educated. But
Mhm.
in reality, and when you read about how love is depicted, everything is about honor.
Hmm. Interesting.
You have very little of um, uh, descriptions of the knight who is really suffering. In the French text, the knight suffers a lot out of love, but in the Swedish text, he needs to marry because he wants to defend his honor. And
Hmm.
also the Swedish Floir, even though that is a really purely a love tale, it shifts the focus a bit towards the adventure, because it's an adventure to find his beloved who has been taken away as a prisoner. So even though it's also about love, there is there is always the honor behind, which is bigger
Mhm.
than the love itself.
So, and I think you sort of touched on this before, but how about the status of women in these two different approaches?
Yeah, that's very, I mean, women they are very interesting, and that's one of the main themes in my book. It's hard to give a very clear answer in um, but the very easy answer would be to say that often the woman is reduced to this sign of honor, so she will bring honor to her husband when he marries her. But then she is also she also has power. You have, I mean, first of all, the most obvious thing is that this is a literature that was written at the behest uh, of a woman. Two of these texts were written at the behest of Queen Euphemia, not all of them, but two. So you have a woman as at the very origin, and then also the manuscripts that are kept, are some of them belonged to women of the court. So this is a very female literature, and in some of the texts, the woman is depicted in a very as a very strong character. She has a lot of power, and perhaps even more sometimes than the French one. So she's extremely interesting, and I don't think she was the main uh, public of the text. I think that the translator perhaps wrote more in order to please the knight, but still, I mean, yeah, still this is a literature very closely linked to the female part of the court.
So what about the sort of the physical characteristics of the books themselves? Was there any difference? Did they have? Because I know sometimes they would draw a lot of imagery,
Yeah, no,
stylized.
they are very poor, these manuscripts. So if you look at the French manuscripts, you have these, I mean, wonderful medieval manuscripts with lovely colors, very strong colors, and really like modern comics, more or less. But the Swedish manuscripts are very simple. They are really just text written down. So they are not, I wouldn't say, so interesting on a static level. They are just, they are texts.
Okay. So let me turn to how you've been doing your research for this work. Do you look at what do you use to do your analysis?
Yeah, what I try to look at to start somewhere, to look at the manuscripts, but in this case, the texts that I have studied are so well known in most of the cases, and they are mostly edited. So when I work, once I have had a try to look at different copies or manuscripts, I mainly use the edited texts, and I compare them. I don't have a very fancy method, I think, but I love to compare. So I look at I have my French text, and then I look at often word for word what happens in the Low German, in the Swedish, in the Old West Norse, and so on, and I try to compare. And then I when I find interesting, I mean, sometimes it's interesting to see that it is the same, actually, that this is always the same in all versions. Then that is a point. And sometimes I mean, the very big differences are the most interesting things, and then I will focus on that. But I'm a very I like to stay very close to my texts, and to observe on a very empirical level.
Where do they house the originals? Where are they kept?
The manuscripts, you mean? They are kept at different libraries in different parts of Europe and the world. So I haven't seen them all, of course. And many of them, especially on the French side, are so prestigious that you couldn't even actually hold them in your own hand, but they are digitized, or so you can look at them, but not really. But they are at different libraries, and on the Swedish side, many of them are here in Stockholm, or but not only, but yeah, at different libraries.
What are the major I'm not familiar with Stockholm, so what are the major libraries where they have these sorts of things? I'm just curious.
In Stockholm, there is the Royal Library of Stockholm, so that is the one, and then you have one in Uppsala as well, the University Library of Uppsala, where you can also find many manuscripts. So that would be the two Swedish libraries.
Okay. So doing this research, you have your thesis, and you look at you find what you find, but was there something that stood out as most surprising to you? And I know you've been working on it for a while, so maybe
Yeah,
nothing feels too surprising now, but maybe something just
no,
pops out.
yeah, but I'm not sure surprising is the right word, but the point I tried to make, and we didn't talk about that, so maybe I will
Oh, yeah.
say that now, is the question of Europeanization, because I really think that and what's perhaps surprising is that on the one hand, I tried to argue that the French Romance functioned as a means to contribute to the Europeanization of medieval culture. It was spread widely, but it also insisted on specific themes that became part of what we call today Western literature. But and at the same time as the Romance was part of this Europeanization process, the Romance also functioned as a means to establish a national Swedish literature. And I think that the tension between the national and the European is very interesting.
Mhm. Was there a particular question as you're doing your research, and maybe it still exists for you? What question really would you like an answer to, and in what way would you be able to reach that answer?
Oh, but I don't think I will ever reach that answer, but I would love to know, I mean, very concretely, who were these translators? I have lived with them since since 2000. I'm employed at the university since 2008, and I work on these texts. So this is more than, I've been doing this for quite a long time, and I don't know really, who were the persons behind what. I would love to meet them. Who were they, and how did they, what did they, I would like to know also, how did these texts actually reach Scandinavia, not only Sweden, but because we have all these hypotheses, but what, how did it work very concretely? Am I right when I say that this was something they got to know when they studied abroad, for example, or perhaps these texts arrived in a very different way. But I'm afraid it's very hard to know because these things are lost. I don't know how you could actually track it, but I would really like to know all these very concrete things, because I am a very literary scholar, and I tend to focus on more the literary motifs, but of course, and that is possible to do. And I can, of course, in my new project, I look at nature, for example, and that's very fascinating. But still, you have this, the very concrete background. How did the texts really, how did they end up in Scandinavia?
And I think I think we might have touched on this, but I'll ask it again. Did 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 any Swedes write their own romance literature after these were translated?
Yes, very good question. One of so I have talked about Queen Euphemia today, so she had 3 texts translated, and I have studied 2 of them in my book. But there is a 3rd one about a certain Duke Frederick of Normandy, and this is a very funny text. It's different from the others, and it's a text which is said to go back to a German version of a French original. But the thing is that there are no such German or French texts. Nothing is left. We only have the Swedish. So perhaps that could be some sort of pseudo translation. I don't really believe it. I think there must have been a source, but still, it cannot be excluded that it is actually an invention. But then it took some time. The very famous Swedish text that was written and in a way was very influenced by these translations was the Erikskrönikan, the Erik Chronicle. So that's a historical chronicle. It's not at all about set in this very fictional world, but still it picks up these motifs from the translations about courtly manners and so on. So it's very connected, and then other chronicles follow. But it takes some time before you really get to something purely Swedish, if you could say so.
Mhm. So, since you have mentioned both France and Germany, how much did each impact Swedish culture at this time, relatively speaking? I don't quite understand the interplay between those 3 culturally at this time.
So you said the French, the German, and
Swedish.
the
Yeah,
Swedish.
yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I would say that the German was, it was really important. So once again, you had the Hanseatic League, so
Right.
this trade union, which and the result was that especially the Low German culture was more or less Swedish, I mean, I think it was so important that it is actually quite hard to separate them, because it influenced everything. It influenced language, culture, literature, everything, and there are lots of contacts between these two cultures. Whereas the French culture, well, it's easier perhaps to identify influences because it was more distant, and the contacts were they were there, but not they were not as frequent and deep. So they could be associated, for example, with, I mean, courtly literature, art, architecture, and of course the university culture. So French culture was very well known, I think, but not in the whole society. It was much more an elite culture.
So it sounds as though then it took the queen, taking the step like, hey, we're gonna adopt this literature. Like it took one or a couple people. It wasn't like something that was diffusing into
No,
Sweden.
exactly. No, you needed a person. But of course it's, I mean, since the Low German is so present, it is not something that the translator especially wants to put forward, because it doesn't sound very exotic to say that this was translated from Low German. But it is much more prestigious and exotic to translate something from French. So French has this, yes, the prestige that it has still today, I would say, but also in the Middle Ages it was a very prestigious culture, and it wasn't yeah.
Was there anything in French culture or society or anything that when the translators encountered may have been completely unfamiliar with and didn't know what to do with? And that could be literally an object, an item, a concept, anything.
Oh, yes. Yes. I mean, there are misinterpretations, but now of course, I cannot give a very good example. But yeah, for example, the translators, sometimes they mix characters, but that's not linked to the very French context. I see what you mean. I cannot think of a good example now, but of course you can. I mean, there are lots of mistakes, I think, things that, I mean, they are not, I mean, very often the translator adapts the source in a very conscious way, but sometimes it's just an error. He didn't understand what he was translating and he gets it wrong. But it's perhaps more on a very linguistic level, that he misinterprets words and names, for example, and who is who in the story. It's not always clear. It's not always clear to me either, and the same happened to the medieval translator.
Do any of the texts have any notes, or did maybe any of the noble people who read them write notes or comments at all in any of these,
Oh,
any versions?
not any. How do you say? There might be some, but nothing more, how do you say, consistent, or nothing, not more, nothing you could get out of it. Not that I really know. There might be something in the manuscript that I don't know, but not that I know, really, no.
And I ask because I'm reading a history of the York brothers from England, and Richard III apparently liked to make notes in his
Yeah,
his
that's wonderful.
knightly
Yeah.
romances and say, yes, I want to be like this, or something to
Oh,
that
yeah.
effect.
I think that I mean, the Swedish texts, I would say, were probably read out aloud. So it's really oral literature. And you could imagine the scene, they were having a feast at the court, having a nice dinner, and then somebody would read the text aloud. I don't think it was probably read by some silently, but mostly this was intended to be read out aloud. So that might explain why we don't really have these kinds of notes.
Interesting. What do you hope the book will do then for apart from simply educating them on this topic? What else would you like readers to take away from this?
From my book, you mean?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. First of all, I hope that my point about Europeanization will be I hope that it will be a bit discussed, and that I don't think that I got as far as I could. There's much more to say about the role of the French romance as part of a Europeanization process. So I would love if somebody could take this further. But then, of course, I also hope that this book will take medieval Swedish literature more seriously from now, and because there are so few books that actually look at Swedish literature, medieval Swedish literature, as a whole, not only one specific text, but several. So I hope that my book will show that there is something interesting in there, and more to study, because many times I just scratch the surface. So there's so much you could write. I mean, I probably, and I mean, you know this, and I probably said it, but what is so fascinating about medieval translation is that, I mean, it's not at all what we consider as translation. It's so different. The translators in the medieval translator is so free to do what he wants, and that freedom is extremely fascinating to investigate, and that is why you can find so much in translation. It's not lost, but it is really found there.
Did you have any difficulties getting the book published, finalized and published?
Not so much. It was a lot of work, but I've been very thankful to DS Brewer. They have been really great. They have helped me a lot, and it has felt very, I mean, I published my doctoral dissertation as the most simple publication ever, and this has been a very dramatic change to publish a book with a professional editor. So I've got a lot of help and support, and that has really been wonderful. But then I've also learned a lot, and it has been a tough process in terms of work. And I am working on a new book, and I think that I will be that I have learned many things in order to avoid this work in very last minute. And I discovered especially very many errors in just before the book was sent into printing, and that was very hard. So yeah. But now these things are corrected, and I'm extremely grateful once again to DS Brewer, because they really helped me to get me through this very last and very hard work. But
okay, so what about, and you touched on your current project, can you go more into it? You mentioned nature.
Yeah, I will continue in the world of medieval romance, but this time I will focus on the Arthurian romance, and the question of different landscapes and borders in the Arthurian romance. That is what I'm interested in now. I study landscapes like the forest and the mountain, and how different landscapes are depicted in different Arthurian romances in Europe. And I try to look at the Arthurian romance as a really European genre. So the question of Europeanization is still very much a priority, and something that I'm very keen to continue to explore.
Mm-hmm. And so what countries do you find the Arthur concept or story? You know, it's most people think, you know, Britain, the UK, when they think King Arthur, but
yeah,
but where else? Just for listeners, and what?
Yeah, so France and Britain, of course. Germany is extremely important. So both the High German, Middle High German, Middle Low German traditions. The Dutch Arthur is very important, and perhaps now he is getting more and more studied, but for a long time he was a bit forgotten. I think that was much due to that people didn't read Dutch, so he's harder to assess. Of course, the Old Norse and the Icelandic Arthur is extremely interesting, because Arthur arrived very quickly in Iceland. One of the first adaptations, or there is a wooden door in Iceland, which and it's very early compared to other versions. So even though Iceland is a periphery on a very geographical level, it's not at all a periphery in terms of literary exchange. So Iceland is interesting. I mean, you have Sweden, Denmark, Spain, Italy. It comes a bit later, but Arthur is there. So you have the whole of Europe, really. But of course, I have my limitations and my linguistic competencies, so I cannot look at exactly everything. But I try to collaborate with scholars also who can help me with other languages, and if possible, really to study this tradition as a whole.
Do you see Arthur much in the further east in Europe? Austria, Hungary.
Yeah, but I know this very little actually. He appears, but not so much. So my focus is really on the western part. But that is also due to, I suppose, my ignorance, and that I wouldn't even be able to study these texts. So I have to focus on the languages that I can actually read.
And is Arthur always a part of the nationality of the country that's writing about him? It's not like he's a British Arthur that people are writing about each.
Oh no, he can be. I mean, in Sweden, in the texts, in one of the texts in my new book now, I mean, he is described as somebody from abroad. He's not at all a Swedish king. I would say the contrary. He is like someone from the outside. So that is, of course, very interesting. Is he some sort of exotic figure, or is he part of the very indigenous culture? And that it depends on the text, perhaps not only on the specific context, but really on each translator, each text. But in most cases, and that is what I think is very interesting with Arthur, is that he always remains very peripheral. He's never, I mean, you don't really get to know Arthur himself. You get to know his surroundings and his knights and his world, but Arthur himself is just there, and he's somewhere but still nowhere. And perhaps that's part of his success. He manages to stay away and to let his close people take his place.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So where can people find you online? Do you have social media, website, anything like that to follow your thoughts?
Yeah, I have Facebook. I'm very old-fashioned, and I have my university website, but I should have a website. I don't. It's just a lack of time. But I have a website on Stockholm University, and I also have a web or a page. I don't know how you say a page at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study. So my two institutions, Stockholm University and the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study.
Okay.
I'm there.
Okay, and your name is spelled Sofia and then Loden, I guess.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Marks.
Yes.
Cool. So that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, not really. I'm very happy. It was a very nice discussion.
Good. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this video version of Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you like this episode, please subscribe for more. If you want daily book suggestions for new fiction and nonfiction studies in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, mysteries, gaming, game design, film history, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Cris Alvarez, my website, crisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com, and my Twitch channel, Full Contact Nerd. If you're looking for new military and general history books and information, check out warscholar.org, my YouTube channel, Warscholar1945, and my podcast, Military History Inside Out. If you want new technology, science, and space books, check out technologyandspace.com and my podcast, Technology and Space. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.